Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, that rocket didn't exactly go to plan last night. What did it say about the broader policy direction of this government? Are there any metaphors we can tease out? Well, today we'll be talking about that rocket launch, the space sector, and indeed strikes, our stuttering economy, and new free ports being announced today. All that to come after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:32. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB Newsroom. A new bill to ensure a minimum level of public service during strike action is to be introduced by the government today. The legislation would require some trade union members to continue working during strikes. It comes amid a wave of industrial action across the public sector in a dispute over pay. Business Secretary Grant Shapps told GB News the legislation is necessary to protect the public.
We don't really ever want to have to use that legislation. In those most recent strikes, the Royal College of Nursing, the nurses, agreed a set national level of support. Unfortunately, we couldn't get there with ambulances across the country, meaning there was a bit of a postcode lottery as to whether an ambulance would turn up in the case of, something serious like a heart attack or a stroke. And we can't have that, so common sense tells us that we need to have minimum safety levels.
Meanwhile, teachers in schools across Scotland have begun the first of their two-day strike after failing to reach an agreement over pay with the Scottish Government. The current offer would see most staff in classrooms receive a 5% pay rise, but unions are demanding a 10% increase. Primary school teachers will walk out today, while staff at secondary schools will walk out tomorrow. Labour has promised a package of welfare reforms under their leadership to help people return to work. The party claims the reforms will help disabled people or those on sickness benefits to find work. Under the plan, the claimants will try paid work, and if it doesn't work out within a year, then they can go back to benefits they were on. Fans queued from midnight outside some stores to buy a copy of Prince Harry's memoir as it finally hit the shelves. The Duke of Sussex's controversial book, Spare, contains intimate details of his life and family. Several stories have already been leaked as some bookstores in Spain started selling it last week. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
It's 9:34 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, this morning I want to acknowledge that last night Britain's first space launch attempt from our own soil failed to make it to orbit. 9 satellites were lost. This sad failure means that the last time Britain successfully launched a satellite into orbit was October 1971, launched from Australia. As the Business Secretary, Grant Shapps, said last night, the UK is the only country in the world more than 50 years ago to have designed, built and launched its own rockets and satellites successfully into space and then scrapped the entire launch programme. This was thanks to our Black Arrow rocket at a time when the United Kingdom held 3rd place in the international space race behind the USA and the USSR. Yet in the 1970s, this successful programme was scrapped. The Black Arrow programme was cancelled after just 4 launches on economic grounds. The 5th machine, which was constructed but never launched, now has its top 2 segments preserved at the Science Museum in London. The first stage of the rocket is at Farnborough Air Sciences Trust Museum. It's sad to think that Britain, once a world leader in this field, is taking so long to catch back up. But it's not the end of the story. Last night's failure is just a hiccup on the long road of becoming a significant player in this field once again. There are 7 spaceports now in the UK, from Cornwall to Shetland. 4 are for horizontal launches, as we saw last night, and 3 are for vertical launch. All of these spaceports are designed for the development of the growing private small satellite market. Remarkable machines, some of which are just the size of a shoebox and are taking up an ever larger proportion of launches. There will be more rocket launches from the UK. It's expected there will be more launches even this year. The UK will become the first part of Europe to successfully launch satellites from our own soil. And with 7 of the world's top 20 universities and genuine excitement in the sector over the UK's willingness to get back into the space launch game, our country is best placed to harness the power of the new private sector revolution in space. Experts predict that the UK may be able to command up to 1/3 of small satellite launches. And despite last night's hiccup, that's something to get excited about. Back to politics proper now. The Health Secretary and the Prime Minister are thought to be considering a new pay offer for nurses, with the prospect of a one-off payment also still on the table. This is as the government scrambles to avoid further industrial action. And of course, the government is considering minimum safety levels, now set to be legislated for in the coming weeks. This as discussions between the government and the health unions have been described as bitterly disappointing by the Royal College of Nursing. Now, earlier in the programme, on the channel, Grant Shapps, the Business Secretary, told us that the government are keen to find a solution to help health workers.
It's in the interest of everybody, those who are striking, but obviously the country as a whole. And people like nurses do a terrific job and did through COVID, which is why they were the only ones to get a pay rise in the public sector last year with COVID. And we hope that we can find a way forward, a settlement. But today in Parliament behind us, I'll be introducing a minimum safety level, service level bill, which will sort of say, look, we will never withdraw the right to strike from people, but when there are strikes on, life and limb must come first, and there has to be a minimum safety standard put in place for that.
Well, I'm delighted now to be joined by the longest-serving political editor in the country, a man who's almost seen it all. Nigel Nelson is the political editor for the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People. Nigel, thanks for joining us this morning. I suppose, first of all, the government is really picking a fight when it comes to this minimum safety level legislation, what we used to refer to as minimum service level, and the government seems to have rebranded now, perhaps in an attempt to make it seem less controversial. But there are some who do think this is a fairly controversial piece of legislation.
Yes, and especially the unions do. They think it'll lead to more strikes and more industrial action. If you insist on a minimum service level, there are other things you can do apart from strike, like overtime bans, go-slows, and that's the kind of thing that will actually just prolong industrial disputes. What is interesting, I think, is there seems to have been a bit of watering down here. As you pointed out, that Grant Shapps was once talking about minimum service levels, and he now talks about minimum safety levels. Now, while I can see how that applies to nurses who already do that and ambulance workers who don't, I'm not quite sure how you get a minimum safety level when it comes to rail workers and teachers. This is likely to get, either way, this is likely to be challenged through the courts. And it really comes down to whether going on strike is a basic human right. If the courts rule it is, that means it'll be in breach of human rights laws.
And yet there are some services that aren't allowed to strike. I believe that firemen, for example, are not allowed to withdraw their labour as things stand. It is interesting also to see that in France and in Spain and in Italy, there are versions of this legislation on their statute books. Is this perhaps the United Kingdom catching up to where a lot of other countries are already?
Well, I mean, firefighters are actually allowed to strike. I mean, the people who aren't are the police and prison officers. Prison officers is an interesting one because they've been getting the right to strike and then losing it and then getting it back again. That happened twice during a Labour government. So those are the areas which are not allowed to strike, including the armed forces. And yes, Grant Shapps will argue we're trying to catch up with Europe, and it depends how the legislation is actually working. Now, I can see that you need some kind of minimum service level when it comes to ambulance staff. Certainly nurses, and if doctors who are balloting at the moment do go on strike, they seem to be operating that system anyway. Let's hope the legislation, if it comes through, is never used, as Grant Shapps promises. But it does actually neuter certain strikes if he goes ahead. And that is something the unions are not going to put up with.
It's a really interesting point because, of course, Rishi Sunak has been criticised by the Labour Party over many weeks for being weak, for not taking strong stands. I suppose this is at least one area of policy where he does seem to be wanting to put a mark in the sand, maybe even to have a battle.
Yes, I mean, I think that the way that Rishi Sunak sees it is rather the same way that Margaret Thatcher did. She stared down the miners and won that battle. Rishi Sunak thinks that he can get away with this one by staring down the unions and just not budging. Now, the difference between him and Margaret Thatcher is that Rishi Sunak is fighting on too many fronts to be able to win it. Margaret Thatcher could close the mines, but Rishi Sunak can hardly close down hospitals, schools and railways.
No, it's an interesting point. Just finally, Nigel Nelson, I'm looking at the diary of the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He popped up in the House of Commons yesterday, he gave a little speech about housing, criticising Sadiq Khan and all the rest of it. And tonight, he is the guest of honour at a dinner at the Carlton Club, unveiling a portrait of himself. The Carlton Club, of course, this sort of centre of Tory political thought. I wonder, is Boris Johnson on manoeuvres?
Well, we'd all like to know quite what he's up to. There are certainly a number of Tory MPs who think that he should make a comeback, and everybody will be watching his speech tonight at the Carlton Club to see if there's any kind of coded hints that that's what's on his mind. I don't think there will be. I think it'll be a typical Boris funny speech, well delivered as he always does, and very entertaining. I doubt he will say anything about whether or not he's thinking about trying to be Prime Minister again. And it is very difficult to see how that could happen. I mean, the danger point for Rishi Sunak is the May local elections. GBNews polls consistently put the Tories 20 points behind, so it looks like he's facing a drubbing there. But the idea of swapping Prime Minister yet again, I think, would be very difficult without a general election.
I suppose the other argument is that if there were a reversion of prime ministers rather than a straight swap, we could all pretend that the last 6 or so months haven't happened. But that may be wishful thinking on the part of some people who support Boris Johnson. For now, Nigel Nelson, political editor at the Sunday Mirror and Sunday People, thanks for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Next today, Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove is to deliver a written statement in the Commons. English free ports, an update. A second round of free ports are expected to be announced in Felixstowe and Harwich and in the Liverpool City region. But what are free ports? Are they a Brexit benefit? And how could they help boost our economy? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Dr. Eamon Butler, Director of the Adam Smith Institute, who was appointed to the Free Ports Advisory Panel by the government in 2019. Thank you for joining us, Eamon. I suppose, first of all, in very basic terms, what is a free port?
A free port is an area where, usually next to an airport or a seaport, where you can bring in goods. You can bring in components, for example. You can assemble them into finished goods. You can pack them. You can label them, and then you can send them out again without having to pay customs duty when you bring everything in. So it's like a little area that's not really part of the country, so that you can do your business there and then export again without facing any British customs charges.
And this could help boost the economy in what way?
Well, it means that there are many of these free ports around the world. There are many thousands, in fact, and we don't really have any here at all. We had an earlier round, which wasn't terribly effective. But the idea is that these would act as a hub where businesses could go and locate and do all this international trade without getting the hit of British customs. And that would attract in jobs and attract innovation and more prosperity in the regions. So in terms of levelling up, that's part of the agenda.
It's interesting looking back at that first Free Ports Advisory Panel on which you sat in 2019. We've got a picture that we can show viewers on television of it. There's Liz Truss, who was leading the panel there, sitting next to then Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Rishi Sunak, who's sitting next to you in this photograph. And it's interesting looking at this photograph. Way back in 2019, there was an argument as to who was sort of spearheading the Free Ports agenda, Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak. There they are sitting together. And over the summer, there was an argument over what were free ports to be. Liz Truss said she wanted full-fat free ports. Some were sort of conflated with enterprise zones. Are there different degrees of how successful free ports can be, how radical free ports can be?
Yes, because what you don't see in that picture is about the 30-odd Treasury civil servants who were sitting at the back of the room. You know, that's when I thought this idea is not going to work. If the Treasury is too deeply involved, because the Treasury wants to keep every atom of revenue that it can. And I think you've got to think differently in these things. So yes, Liz Truss was very much in favour of making it full fat. The current proposal basically from the Treasury is that yes, there might be a few reliefs on taxation, things like national insurance and business reliefs, but there's not going to be any deregulation. That's not part of it. And I think that's absolutely essential, that what we need is a regulatory sandbox so that in these areas you can try different sorts of regulation and deregulation, and you can see what works and you can see what brings in the trade and what doesn't make much of a difference. So I think, yes, we need to do that. And we need to... Sorry, go on.
So is your expert view here, as someone who sat on that advisory panel, that the way in which the Sunak government is going about these free ports may well not actually unlock the benefits that these free ports could have?
Oh yes, absolutely. As I say, you need a regulatory sandbox. You need to really think about taxation. For example, in a free port, you might get several different firms that are working on the same product. You know, one might be assembling the components, another might be making them into a finished product, another might be packing them, another might be labeling them. Now, at the moment, they've got to pay VAT on each of those processes. As it goes from one firm to the next. Now, you know, what we would say is, no, treat this area as if it's not really a part of the United Kingdom, so that you don't pay all of these taxes. And that's what happens in other places like Dubai, for example, where there are huge reliefs. And you go to Dubai, you don't pay income tax for 3 years, and you don't pay company tax for 3 years. And we're really trying to compete against that. So you've got to make it full fat or it won't work.
That is really, really interesting there. Dr. Eamon Butler, thank you so much for talking us through that free port agenda. I think a lot of people think of these things as a binary. Either you have a free port or you don't. But what we've heard very clearly there is how you go about those free ports can matter almost to a greater extent than whether you have them at all. Well, let's discuss further with all of these different subjects: the return of Boris Johnson, the failure of that space flight, the free ports and those minimum safety legislations. I'm joined in the studio now by Olivia Utley, our political reporter. Gosh, politics is really back in a very quick way, I suppose, this week. We're looking at a busy parliamentary calendar and, of course, Rishi Sunak appearing at Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow. What on earth, of all of these issues, is the Labour Party going to go on?
Yes, it does feel like politics is back with a bang after a very long quiet period, really, almost ever since Rishi Sunak came into office. The main issue at the moment is obviously the strikes. The ambulance strikes tomorrow will have a very hard-hitting effect on ordinary people. How hard Labour go on this minimum safety legislation will be very interesting. The briefings this morning is that they will go pretty hard, and the angle which it's expected they'll probably go for is this idea that it's not practical, that actually minimum safety service legislation could end up with more strikes. That's because we could see lots of strikes coming out before they bring it in, or we could see action, and perhaps we could see action which is just falls short of officially what would count as a strike under this legislation, but would massively curtail the services that people have access to in those periods. So it's thought that that will be the angle, because that would be quite clever positioning for Labour, not quite supporting the strikers per se, but going on the practicality angle of it.
It's interesting, though, because so many European countries have similar legislation to this. I suppose the argument that the Labour Party have, the strongest one they have, is that in the few months before this legislation comes about, there may be disruption. Is that the strongest argument?
Well, yeah, it's tricky because, as we have heard time and time again now from lots of government ministers, France and Germany have very, very similar legislation. And as you suggested there, as you alluded to, this could be seen as just Britain catching up with what other European countries already have. And the government's making it clear that it's not going to apply to all public services at all. It'll just be those sectors. Nurses already do provide a minimum safety service, and they would extend that to include ambulance workers. So it's likely to be a pretty popular measure. Labour, yes, they don't want to look as though they're in the pockets of the unions, but on the other hand, they've got to get some clear blue water between themselves and the Tories, obviously, on an issue like strikes. So they're going to be walking quite a tricky line. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
It certainly will, and in the broader context of everything, we're seeing a remarkable stubbornness in these polls. I think a lot of people expected that the Labour Party's brief foray into sort of 20-point plus leads, that would decrease over time, that was the aberration. But we're looking at all of these polls, not only the GB News People's polls that we specially commission, but also YouGov and Survation and Comres and all the other companies. They're showing a remarkably consistent picture of no Rishi bounce.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a sort of general feeling in Westminster now that the next election will be Keir Starmer's to lose. And previously it's been said that, Keir Starmer perhaps doesn't have the kind of energy to win an election. But it now feels as though Rishi Sunak is going to have to outline a very clear vision of a reason to vote Conservative to be able to get anywhere. And of course, last week we saw him beginning to do that with a speech setting out his vision. But there were plenty of people who thought it was a bit thin on the ground. So that's going to be the real challenge for Rishi Sunak now. He can't rest on his laurels at all. He's going to have to present a very different image to what Keir Starmer is offering. Because, yes, if Keir Starmer keeps his head down, stays quiet for the next few months, even years, we could just see these polls playing out into a general election scenario.
Now, you were at that speech that Rishi Sunak gave in East London, and you asked about childcare reform, a really, really important point of government thinking that was ditched by Rishi Sunak. Liz Truss wanted to bring in childcare reform, make it easier to get childcare, cheaper to get childcare. Rishi Sunak seems to have put that on ice. Similarly, we were just talking about free ports. Liz Truss wanted these full, flat free ports with deregulation as well as lower taxes. And Rishi Sunak's going back to this sort of treasury model of free ports that aren't as liberating and may not be as exciting. Is this government throwing away a lot of the potential, I don't want to say wild cards, but economy-boosting things that might actually shift the dial?
Yes, and there are plenty of, Tory backbenchers, there are plenty of them who definitely feel like that, who feel frustrated. It was said that, Rishi Sunak, as soon as he went into the Treasury, got sort of institutionalised, and that's a feeling which has sort of carried over into him being Prime Minister. The childcare issue is one that Rishi Sunak has had a bit of a problem before of being seen as a kind of technocrat and not being seen as a real conservative, a sort of social conservative. And one thing that he was very keen, I noticed in the speech over and over again, he mentioned lots of themes which are very important to social conservatives, for example, the family. But it didn't seem to come with much serious policy thought behind it. So if you are a government that says that you care about keeping families strong, then obviously a sensible policy, one would have thought, would be to make childcare cheaper for families to help solve, for example, the baby bust, which we've talked about before. But it doesn't really seem to have the kind of policy push to enact any of those ideas, which I think is going to be a really big challenge for him, because making the right noises isn't enough when you've got Labour, just as you say, consistently so far ahead in the polls.
It's remarkable that it does seem to be that this sort of idea from Number 10 to stabilise everything, to not make too much noise, to sort of be a bit more boring, well, that's fine if you're ahead in the polls and you stabilise things there. But in fact, all they've done is stabilise their position 20 points behind.
Well, absolutely. And I've had multiple Conservative MPs in the last few weeks and months really talk about managed decline. And that is certainly a feeling on the Conservative backbenches. And there's now real urgency for Rishi Sunak to present some sort of serious vision, because, as we know, voters struggle to differentiate between the two men in charge of our main parties. And they prefer Keir Starmer because change is, as good as a tonic.
Really, really interesting stuff there. We'll have to have a look at that clash between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer tomorrow at midday, shown here, of course, on GB News. And also, tomorrow morning, we'll bring you all of that news from Boris Johnson's speech tonight. What might he say? I am very excited. But that's it from me today. Don't go anywhere. Coming up, it's Bev Turner Today.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Esther Rack